In the quiet village of St. Marymead, life often moved at the gentle pace of a ticking clock, steady, predictable, and comfortingly familiar. That's why when the old Stardust Cinema reopened after nearly 2 decades, it stirred a rare buzz of excitement among the villagers. Posters for the grand screening of The Woman in Scarlet, a once popular film from the 1950s, were pasted on every bulletin board, every post office wall, and even the notice board outside the vicarage. Miss Jane Marple, the village's sharpest observer and most underestimated mind, had never been one for cinema. Far too many distractions from real life, she often said. Still, when Mrs. Bantry offered her an extra ticket, claiming it would do her some good to get out and see people again, Miss Marple graciously accepted. The newly refurbished cinema gleamed with fresh paint and polished brass fixtures. Velvet curtains hung beside the screen, and the once musty lobby now smelled faintly of lavender and lemon polish. The villagers filled the seats with chatter and laughter, exchanging gossip and guessing whether the film would still hold up after all these years. Among the notable guests was Marina Gregg, a famous but fading film actress who had recently taken residence at Gossington Hall. She had made headlines not long ago after a tumultuous divorce and retreat from public life. It was whispered she had donated money to help restore the Stardust Cinema. She's trying to reconnect with her roots, some said, or perhaps relive her glory days. Others added with a tinge of envy. Marina arrived just before the screening, flanked by her husband, the film director Jason Rudd, and her ever-present assistant Ella Zielinski. The crowd gave her a small round of applause, more out of curiosity than adoration. Marina smiled faintly, her expression distant, as though haunted by something the rest of the world couldn't see. The lights dimmed, the chatter faded, the opening credits rolled, and the audience settled into their seats. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and folded her gloved hands in her lap, quietly observing the figures around her more than the screen itself. About 20 minutes into the film, something changed. A sudden, high-pitched gasp pierced the darkness, followed by a crash. The screen went black, not just a scene in the film, but the actual projector. The reel stuttered to a halt. Murmurs rippled through the audience as the emergency lights flickered on. And there, in the third row from the front, a woman slumped in her seat. Her head lolled unnaturally to one side, her eyes frozen wide in shock. A scream followed, then chaos. Someone shouted for a doctor. Another ran to fetch the constable. But it was too late. The woman, Heather Badcock, a longtime fan of Marina Gregg, was dead. Miss Marple didn't move immediately. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the scene. She had seen death before, its sudden stillness, its cruel surprise. But something about this death felt off. It wasn't panic that rose in her chest, but curiosity. Why had Heather Badcock been sitting so close to the famous actress? Why did Marina Gregg look not surprised, but expectant? And why? In that moment just before the screen went dark, had Heather leaned forward with such purpose, as if saying something deeply important. The constable arrived quickly, along with the village doctor, who confirmed what Miss Marple had already suspected: poison. Heather Badcock had died within minutes, seconds perhaps, of ingesting a fast-acting toxin. Whispers spread like wildfire. Was it food poisoning from the wine and cheese served before the film? Was it a heart attack brought on by excitement? Or was it murder? The screening was canceled, the theater emptied, and the authorities sealed off the building. But Miss Marple stayed behind. She moved quietly, her presence hardly noticed by the officials now crowding the scene. She studied the seating chart. She looked at the wine glasses still sitting on the side table in the lobby. She watched as Marina Gregg was led away, dazed and silent, her husband Jason protective and visibly shaken. Heather Badcock had no known enemies. She was cheerful, harmless, the kind of person who always had a tray of scones ready for guests. But she had also been persistent, especially in befriending Marina Gregg. Some said she was clingy, always eager to remind the actress of how she once met her backstage at a London premiere. Heather often boasted that moment changed her life. Now, her life had ended in a quiet village cinema, with Marina Gregg sitting just feet away. Miss Marple left the theater as the stars emerged over St. Marymead, a cool wind brushing her face. Her mind was already at work, sifting through facts, faces, and the smallest flickers of behavior. This wasn't just a tragic accident. It was the opening act of something far darker. And Miss Marple had seen enough to know the real drama had only just begun. The next morning, St. Mary Mead buzzed with whispers like a beehive rattled from its slumber. The death of Heather Badcock at the cinema had sent shockwaves through the village. In a place where the biggest scandal was usually a mismatched flower arrangement of the vicarage, murder, or even the possibility of murder, felt surreal. The local paper's headline read, "Tragedy at the Stardust. Fan dies mid-film." But Miss Marple knew it wasn't just tragedy. It was deliberate, calculated, cold. She sat at her kitchen table, stirring her tea thoughtfully, the radio playing soft classical music in the background. Her cat, Ty Glathpilzer, curled beside the hearth, oblivious to human concerns. Miss Marple had already read the front-page article twice. There were no details about the cause of death, only that Heather Badcock had collapsed unexpectedly during the screening and that authorities were investigating. But Miss Marple knew something the paper didn't. Poison leaves traces not just in the body but in behavior. She reviewed the night's timeline in her mind with practiced precision. Heather had arrived at the cinema early, chattering excitedly with her husband, Arthur, and greeting everyone with her usual overly familiar warmth. She brought homemade biscuits for the staff. Just a little something, she'd said, for all their hard work. Some found her endearing, others exhausting. Marina Gregg and Jason Rudd had entered only minutes before the film began. Heather had hurried over to greet them. Miss Marple remembered distinctly how Marina's expression changed in that moment. There was a flicker in her eyes, a momentary freeze in her smile, like someone seeing a ghost. And then the drinks. A tray of champagne had been offered around. Compliment to Marina Gregg, celebrating the film's screening and the cinema's revival. Glasses had clinked. Toasts were made. And shortly after, Heather Badcock was dead. It couldn't be coincidence. Miss Marple put on her gloves and hat. She had questions that needed answers. Her first stop, the vicarage, where Arthur Badcock had taken refuge after his wife's untimely death. She found him sitting stiffly in the vicar's study, hands wrapped around a cup of cold tea. His eyes were red-rimmed, but his grief was mixed with something else, bewilderment. "I just don't understand it," he muttered as Miss Marple gently took the chair beside him. Heather was fine, chatty, excited. She'd been talking about meeting Marina Gregg for weeks. It was like a dream come true for her. And then just like that, Miss Marple patted his hand softly. "Arthur, I know this is difficult, but I wonder, did Heather ever mention anything odd about Marina? Something she said? Anything that felt out of place?" Arthur frowned. "Not really. I mean, she always said Marina was kind, though a bit distant. But Heather could be pushy. You know how she was. Never took no for an answer. Always retelling the story about meeting Marina in London during the war. Some charity gala. Heather kept saying how that moment made her feel seen." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. Did Marina ever acknowledge that moment? Arthur shrugged. I don't think she remembered it, but Heather didn't care. She said Marina was lovely, even if she didn't remember her. There was again that mismatch of memory and emotion. Heather had idolized Marina, but Marina's reaction at the theater had been far from flattered. It was horror, distress. Even was it dread? Miss Marple thanked Arthur and made her way to her next stop, Gossington Hall. The grand estate, nestled on the edge of the village, had seen its share of drama over the years. Now, under the ownership of Marina Gregg and Jason Rudd, it had been renovated with modern luxuries, though a shadow seemed to linger over it halls. She was greeted by Ella Zielinski, Marina's personal assistant, a smart, efficient woman in her early 30s with sharp eyes and a sharper mind. "I'm afraid Miss Gregg is resting," Ella said, her tone apologetic but firm. "She's very shaken by what happened." "I completely understand," Miss Marple replied, her voice soothing. "But perhaps you could help me with something. Just a quick word about the champagne served last night." Ella hesitated. "What about it?" "Well," Miss Marple said, "I was wondering, who poured the glasses? Did everyone have the same drink?" Ella thought for a moment. I helped Jason set up the tray. We opened 2 bottles, poured them ourselves. I think Jason handed out most of the glasses, though. Marina had one, of course. Heather, too. Were the glasses marked anyway? No, Ella said slowly. They were all identical. Crystal flutes from Marina's personal collection. Why? Oh, just idle curiosity, Miss Marple said lightly. You know how we old women are, always nosing about the details. As she walked away from the hall, Miss Marple's mind was racing. There were too many coincidences, too many delicate threads converging at one point, the moment Heather Badcock raised her glass. And someone, perhaps the one who handed her that glass, had been counting on the randomness of a toast to conceal something far more sinister. A drink shared in celebration, a smile, a sip, and then death. But if Heather wasn't the intended target, who was? The answer, Miss Marple suspected, lay not in the drink itself, but in the expressions it evoked. And none had struck her as more peculiar than that of Marina Gregg, an actress whose greatest performance may have just played out in real life. And this time, there was no camera to shout cut. The village of St. Mary Mead might have been small, but secrets had a way of filling its narrow lanes like fog. Miss Marple, with her patient gaze and soft-spoken manner, knew how to let such fog lift, slowly, naturally, with time and the right questions. After her visit to Gossington Hall, Miss Marple returned home and sat beside her window, knitting needles in hand, though she barely moved them. Her mind was elsewhere, sifting through each detail of the previous evening. It wasn't just that Heather Badcock had died, it was how she had died, and even more important, why. The poison, though not yet confirmed publicly, had all the hallmarks of a fast-acting neurotoxin. Something slipped into a drink just moments before it was consumed. The perfect weapon in a crowded room with raised glasses, dim lights, and distracted eyes. But the true clue wasn't chemical. It was emotional. Miss Marple had spent a lifetime observing people. In drawing rooms, garden parties, funerals. She'd seen grief real and feigned, joy genuine and calculated. And what she saw on Marina Gregg's face when Heather approached her was not surprise, or even annoyance. It was terror. A look in her eyes that spoke of recognition. Miss Marple had seen that look once before. During the war, when she'd visited a wounded soldier in a hospital, and another patient, a former officer, was brought in. The soldier had seen him from across the room. The officer hadn't recognized the young man, but the soldier, he'd gone pale. Quiet. He'd said nothing, but the look in his eyes said everything. Fear. A memory surfacing like a body from a deep lake. Marina Gregg had worn that exact same look. So the question was not who would want Heather Badcock dead, but what did Heather know or say that triggered such a look from Marina? Miss Marple needed more context. And context, in a village, often lived in conversation. Her next stop, Dolly Bantry. Mrs. Bantry, a lively widow with a talent for storytelling and a nose for gossip, had been seated beside Marina Gregg that evening. If anyone had noticed something odd, some flicker of interaction, Dolly would remember it. They met for tea that afternoon in Mrs. Bantry's sunroom, where the scent of honeysuckle and polish would mingle pleasantly. I swear, Jane, Dolly began, pouring a generous amount of cream into her cup, it was the most dreadful thing I've ever seen. Poor Heather just collapsed like a marionette whose strings had been cut. What was Marina's reaction? Miss Marple asked, gently prodding. Dolly paused. Well, that's just it. She looked frozen, not just shocked, almost as if, well, she expected it. Or no, not quite, as if she was watching something awful happen again. Again? Dolly nodded slowly. That's what it felt like. She looked at Heather with wide eyes, like she'd seen a ghost. Then, when Heather started choking, Marina stood up but didn't move. Jason rushed in first. Marina just kept staring. And did Heather say anything? Before she drank. She was babbling as usual, Dolly said, waving a hand. Going on about how much she adored Marina, how she'd once met her during the war. Some charity benefit. She must have told that story 100 times, Jane. Said Marina was her inspiration, the reason she volunteered for the WAF. Yes, said Miss Marple softly. Arthur told me as much. Dolly leaned in. But here's something odd. Marina didn't smile. She didn't even seem to remember. And when Heather mentioned that meeting, something in Marina's face changed. It was like she went cold. Miss Marple absorbed this in silence. Heather Badcock, cheerful and naive, had lived her life proud of one fleeting moment, meeting a film star decades ago. But what if that moment wasn't so fleeting for the other person? What if it held something darker? Back home, Miss Marple fetched a notebook and opened a fresh page. Hypothesis. Marina Gregg recognized Heather Badcock from a shared past. Consequence. Recognition triggered panic. Panic suggests danger. Danger suggests motive. If Marina remembered Heather, and that memory was threatening, then perhaps the poison was meant not for Heather, but for Marina herself. Miss Marple considered the implications. What if someone else had intended to kill Marina, but the glass was passed to the wrong person? Or, just as dangerous, what if Marina had reason to believe someone would try to poison her, and had preemptively acted? A murder intended, a memory awakened, a past revisited. The next step was clear. Miss Marple would need to learn more about Marina Gregg. Not the starlet, not the public persona, but the woman behind the magazine covers. The woman with the haunted eyes. Who was she during the war? What happened at that charity gala all those years ago? And why did seeing Heather Badcock bring that memory crashing back like a wave breaking on jagged rocks? Whatever the answer, Miss Marple felt certain of one thing. Marina Gregg was not just a witness to tragedy. She was at its center. The name Marina Gregg was once synonymous with glamour. Her face had graced international magazines. Her voice, smooth, mysterious, and husky, could command silence in any theater. But to Miss Marple, none of that mattered now. What interested her was who Marina had been before the spotlight. Before the diamonds, the directors, the scandals, and the stardom. It was time to look behind the mask. Miss Marple turned to her quiet but effective method of investigation, letters. One went to her nephew Raymond, an author with literary connections and a wide network. Another to a friend in London who volunteered at a film archive. And another, perhaps most crucially, to an old acquaintance in the Foreign Office with access to wartime records. By early evening, one response had already arrived, hand-delivered by the village postmistress. Miss Marple opened the envelope with practiced fingers. The letter was from Raymond's publisher friend in London. It was brief but dense with detail. Marina Gregg, named Margaret M. Griffith, began her career in regional theater at 17. Changed her name in 1939. During the war, she performed with the Entertainment's National Service Association, ENSA, giving performances at hospitals and military bases. There are rumors of a mental health episode in 1942, unconfirmed. She disappeared from public view for nearly a year before re-emerging in a small film titled Whispers in the Night. Some speculate she suffered a breakdown. No official record. Miss Marple tapped the paper thoughtfully. A breakdown? A mysterious year away from public life? If Heather Badcock had met Marina during that year, it might explain the tension. And if something traumatic happened then, Heather's sudden reappearance could have opened old wounds or old dangers. There was only one person who might be persuaded to talk about that missing year. Jason Rudd, Marina's husband and film director, the man who had brought her to St. Mary Mead. The next morning, Miss Marple requested a brief audience at Gossington Hall, this time using a different approach. She sent a note addressed specifically to Mr. Rudd. It read, "Dear Mr. Rudd, as someone who admired your late mother's work and shares an interest in cinema, I wondered if I might trouble you for a few words about your recent screening. There's a small matter I'd like to discuss, and I'd be most grateful for your time. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple." The mention of Jason's mother, an actress in the silent film era, was a calculated touch. Within 2 hours, a reply came. "Miss Marple, I would be glad to receive you this afternoon. Yours, Jason Rudd." At Gossington Hall, Jason greeted her personally, tall, weary-eyed, but composed. His presence had an almost cinematic stillness to it, as if he were always ready for a camera to roll. They sat in the conservatory, sunlight slanting through ivy-laced glass. "Mr. Rudd, Miss Marple began kindly. "I know this is a trying time, but I hope you won't find it improper if I ask a few questions about that night and about Marina." Jason nodded, folding his hands together. "I suspected you might. You got that look." "What look?" "The kind that sees everything, especially things others miss." Miss Marple smiled. "You flatter me. But yes, I do notice things. And I noticed your wife's reaction when Mrs. Badcock approached her at the screening." Jason's jaw tightened. "Yes, I saw it too. It wasn't just surprise, Mr. Rudd. It was recognition and fear." Jason hesitated, then said, "You're not wrong. Marina did recognize her, but it was complicated." "I believe," Miss Marple said gently, "it has something to do with that year she vanished during the war, when she dropped out of public view." Jason gave her a long, searching look. "She never talks about that time," he said finally, "not even to me. But the night Heather died, Marina said something strange. She kept repeating, 'It was her, the woman from the room, the one with the syringe.'" Miss Marple's breath caught slightly. "Syringe?" Jason nodded. "It made no sense to me. I assumed it was just shock. But later, she told me about a clinic, a place she was taken to during her breakdown, somewhere in Wales. She was barely 20. She said there was a nurse there, overly chatty, terribly kind. Marina remembered her face, clearly said it haunted her." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And she believes that nurse was Heather Badcock." "I don't know," Jason admitted, "but I believe Marina thinks so. That's why she looked so afraid. She said seeing Heather was like seeing a ghost from a nightmare." "So you think Marina believed Heather had come to finish something?" Jason ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know what Marina believed. She's had episodes, nightmares. But one thing's certain, she didn't poison Heather. And yet," Miss Marple said quietly, "Heather was the only one who died." Jason met her eyes. "You think someone else was the intended target?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that someone's past came crashing into their present. And when that happens, people panic. They act, sometimes preemptively." There was a long silence between them. Then Jason said, "You're not here as a curious neighbor, are you?" "No," Miss Marple replied, standing. "I'm here as someone who's seen what guilt does to people, and what fear makes them do." As she walked out of Gossington Hall, the pieces began to align. Marina Gregg had a secret buried in her past. Something involving Heather. Something hidden in the fog of a breakdown. Whether it was real or imagined no longer mattered. The effect had been the same. And in that fragile space between memory and reality, murder had found its opportunity. The past has a way of whispering when least expected. And in this case, it had screamed loud enough to kill. Miss Marple sat in her sitting room, eyes fixed on the soft flutter of her lace curtains as the wind toyed with them. Jason Rudd's confession had given her more than just confirmation of Marina's recognition. It had opened a door to something buried, dark, and possibly still dangerous. A sanitarium in Wales. A nurse with a cheery disposition. A syringe. Was Heather Badcock ever truly a nurse during the war? Or had her story been embellished over the years, colored with a touch of harmless fantasy? Miss Marple didn't think so. Heather believed every word she said. She wasn't a liar, just a woman who repeated one good deed until it became her identity. And yet, it was that very identity, her war story, that seemed to trigger Marina Gregg's fear. Miss Marple needed confirmation. So, she called on a resource more reliable than village gossip, old war records. The next morning, a telegram arrived. Her friend in the Foreign Office had come through. Heather Badcock served briefly with Auxiliary Nursing Corps, 1942. Stationed at temporary psychiatric clinic, Brecon, Wales. No notable incidents recorded. Transferred after 6 months. Brecon. That aligned perfectly with Marina's account of her lost year. So, Heather had been there. She was that nurse. Miss Marple's mind turned to motive. If Marina had recognized Heather as a nurse from that traumatic time, and as she believed, rightly or wrongly, that Heather had harmed her during treatment, it could explain her haunted reaction. But something still didn't sit right. Heather Badcock had lived in St. Mary Mead for over a decade. She was harmless, kind, not the sort to hold a grudge, or even remember Marina from all those years ago, beyond the vague story of having met her once at a benefit. The meeting, Miss Marple realized, may never have happened at a benefit. It may have happened in that clinic. And Heather, with her relentlessly positive nature, had rewritten the memory into something pleasant. That was the woman she was. But if Heather had told that charity gala story enough times, and told it again that night to Marina Gregg, then that might have jolted Marina back into remembering the truth. A clinic, a syringe, and perhaps a young nurse who once did something unforgivable. The motive for murder then could be fear, a deep, irrational fear that Heather had returned to expose something, or do it again. So the next question was, how was Heather poisoned? Miss Marple knew from local gossip that the drink trays had been prepared in the kitchen and passed around by the help, none of whom had any clear motive. No strangers had entered the hall. No one saw anything amiss. The poison, according to police, had been slipped into a daiquiri, the very drink Heather had insisted on trying for the first time that evening. And who had handed her that daiquiri? Miss Marple reached for her notebook again. She jotted down the timeline from various sources. Heather arrived, greeted Marina, rambled on about their past meeting. Marina seemed to freeze. Then someone handed Heather a cocktail. She drank it. Seconds later, she collapsed. It was widely assumed that a servant handed her the glass. But one witness, Dolly Bantry, had said something odd, that Marina herself had been holding 2 drinks at one point. That could have been key. Was it possible that Marina prepared her own drink to avoid being poisoned, only for the poisoned glass to go to Heather instead? Or worse, had Marina believed Heather might poison her, and so had switched the glasses? It was a theory that offered both motive and method. Marina, convinced Heather was dangerous, could have added something to the glass first, something to protect herself, to test Heather. And when Heather took the drink instead, it had the reverse effect. Still, this was speculation. Miss Marple needed clarity, and that meant speaking directly to the only person who could confirm the truth of Marina's breakdown and Heather's role in it. So, she arranged a call with the matron of the old clinic in Brecon, now retired but still reachable through a mutual acquaintance. The matron remembered both women. Yes, Heather was a nurse here for a time. The matron had said over the crackly phone line. Always cheerful. Too cheerful, really. A bit naive. She meant well. But there was an incident. One of the patients reacted badly to a medication. Heather administered it without clearance. It caused seizures. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. And the patient, she asked, discharged soon after. Sent abroad. Never returned. Very disturbed. Some said it was the treatment that did it. And the patient's name? Miss Griffith, I believe. Margaret Griffith. Marina Gregg. That was the moment Miss Marple needed. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't madness. Marina had seen Heather and remembered everything. Not a harmless nurse from a party, but the woman who had caused her pain, who had nearly destroyed her, whether by accident or not. Heather had set something in motion all those years ago, and now she was dead for it. But one puzzle still remained. Was it Marina who had poisoned her? Miss Marple doubted it. The method didn't fit. Marina's reaction was genuine shock, even panic. She might have wanted Heather gone, but had someone else acted on that desire? Someone close enough to see Marina's fear and use it? The case was no longer just about old traumas. It was now about who, in that hall, had watched it all unfold and made a deadly choice. Miss Marple knew that in every mystery, there are watchers, people who linger on the edge of scenes, saying little but seeing much. And in this case, someone had watched Marina Gregg descend into fear, heard Heather Badcock's cheerful oblivion, and seized a perfect opportunity. The question was, who? She returned to Gossington Hall, under a different pretense this time. A casual follow-up on village fundraising matters provided a convenient excuse. Jason Rudd wasn't present when she arrived, but the housekeeper led her through the hallway where portraits of past owners still hung, shadowed by history. It wasn't Marina who greeted her, but Ella Zielinski, Marina's personal secretary. Ella was brisk, tightly wound, and had an expression that hinted at constant fatigue or perhaps constant calculation. She wore thick glasses and held a notepad like it was a shield. "Miss Marple," she said, "Jason and Marina are both out for the moment. Is there something I can help you with?" "I was just admiring the way the house has been restored," Miss Marple replied gently, her eyes scanning the walls and side tables. "Quite a transformation. It feels like a stage set, beautiful, but every item seems placed for effect." Ella cracked a tight smile. "That's how Marina likes it. She likes control, even off camera." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Control is a comforting thing, especially when the past is unpredictable. There was a beat of silence. Ella looked away. "I suppose." They moved to the drawing room, where sunlight filtered through heavy curtains. Tea was brought in. Miss Marple waited until the tray was set before she asked, "You were with her that night, during the party?" "I was." "And you handed out drinks?" "No, that was the serving staff. Marina doesn't let me near food service. She says it's not my role." "But you were there when Heather Badcock approached her?" "Yes," Ella replied, more stiffly now. "I was standing just behind her. I heard the whole conversation." "And what did you think of it?" "I thought Heather was being intrusive." She went on and on. "It's no wonder Marina looked upset. Upset enough to poison her?" Ella's face went pale. "I beg your pardon?" "Oh, forgive me," Miss Marple said, sipping her tea. "I'm an old woman. Sometimes I ask things too bluntly. But it's strange, isn't it? A woman walks up, tells a cheerful story, and a few minutes later she's dead. That's not coincidence. That's choreography." Ella set down her teacup with a clink. "If you're implying Marina killed her, you're wrong." "I'm not implying. I'm asking," said Miss Marple calmly. "But more than that, I'm observing. For instance, you seem quite protective of her. She's been through enough." "And she's been generous to you?" Ella hesitated. "She saved me. I was struggling, professionally, personally. She gave me work. Purpose. I'd do anything for her." That, Miss Marple thought, was precisely the problem. Anything. Could loyalty turn deadly? Marina had shown genuine shock at Heather's death. That much was clear. But what if someone else had seen that shock, misunderstood it, or worse, acted on it? Ella Zielinski had motive. To protect Marina, she had opportunity. She was behind the scenes, near the glasses, near the chaos. And she had means, Marina's medications, possibly access to sedatives, barbiturates, or more. Before Miss Marple left, she asked, "Do you know who poured the daiquiris?" Ella didn't blink. Jason did. That was new. And who handed them out? Marina gave one to Heather. She said she wanted to thank her for coming. Miss Marple paused. But how did Marina know which glass was hers? Ella didn't answer. That silence told Miss Marple more than words ever could. Later, back in her cottage, she pieced it together. Jason mixed the drinks. Several daiquiris. Marina, flustered and distracted by Heather's approach, grabbed one from the tray. Heather reached for it. Marina may have hesitated, perhaps even tried to stop her. But Heather, friendly and oblivious, took it anyway. If the glass had been poisoned, it may not have been intended for Heather. Perhaps it was for Marina. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the only glass poisoned, and it had been prepared in anticipation of Marina's drinking it. But if Marina didn't intend to drink it, who would? What if Marina was never the target? What if the poison was placed in the glass after Heather began talking? That meant only one conclusion. Someone heard the story, saw Marina's reaction, and made a deadly decision in that moment. And that someone had to have access, knowledge, a trigger. Miss Marple flipped through her notebook again and landed on something she had written days earlier. Poison requires planning, but not always time. The murderer may have acted on impulse, but even impulses need tools. She needed to know what the poison was, where it came from, who could have had it. And she had one more person to speak with, the housemaid who cleaned Marina's dressing room. Because if someone was tampering with Marina's pills or storing dangerous substances, that's where it would be hidden. Miss Marple stood slowly, feeling the weight of all the pieces in her mind coming closer together. It wasn't just a death at a party. It was a carefully timed act, fueled by loyalty, fear, and perhaps a misguided sense of justice. And someone, somewhere in that grand old house, had committed murder, believing they were saving a star from her past. In St. Mary Mead, no secret stays buried for long. Not when Miss Marple is on the trail. The path now led to the most personal corner of Gossington Hall, Marina Gregg's dressing room, the sanctum of a star, a place where faces are made up, nerves steadied, and old ghosts sometimes revisited. Miss Marple had arranged to speak with Gladys, the quiet and slightly awkward young maid responsible for maintaining Marina's private quarters. She met the girl near the back entrance of Gossington Hall, where the ivy crept up the old stone and the garden smelled of thyme and overwatered roses. Gladys was nervous, her eyes darting like a rabbit's. "I won't get in trouble, will I?" she asked. "Not at all," Miss Marple assured her with grandmotherly calm. "I simply want to ask about your work, the dressing room, the routines, and if anything unusual ever caught your eye." Gladys twisted her hands. "Well, I clean the room twice a day. Once in the morning, once after she's gone to bed. I dust the vanity, throw away tissues, tidy up her bottles, and such." Bottles? Cosmetics? Perfumes? Medicines? Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Yes, ma'am. There's a little tray of them. Sleeping pills, some other tablets. All labeled, but I never touch them." "Of course not. But has anyone else? Anyone who shouldn't have been in the room?" Gladys hesitated. "Well, once. Just once. I saw Miss Zielinski come out of the room. She said she'd gone in to find a lost hairpin of Marina's, but she didn't look like she'd found anything. Looked more like she'd been searching." Miss Marple pressed gently. "Did she seem hurried? Nervous?" "Both." That was enough to form a theory. Ella Zielinski had both motive and access. But to what? Miss Marple inquired further, and Gladys confirmed that Marina's sleeping medication was a barbiturate, Nembutal, strong enough to sedate, even kill in high doses. If that same barbiturate had found its way into Heather Badcock's daiquiri, it would explain the symptoms: sudden collapse, unresponsiveness, death within minutes. It was subtle, easily dissolved in alcohol, and difficult to trace unless someone was looking for it. And if Ella had retrieved it from Marina's supplies, believing she was protecting her employer from a woman who had once caused her breakdown, it was premeditated, but just barely. A sudden decision, built from loyalty, fear, and a warped sense of justice. Still, the timeline needed clarity. Miss Marple returned to her notes and began rebuilding the final minutes before Heather Badcock's death. Jason Rudd mixed the drinks. Marina took 2 glasses, one for herself, one offered to Heather. Heather mentioned a story from the war. Marina froze. Ella was behind her, notebook in hand. Marina's hand shook as she passed Heather the glass. Heather took it gladly. She drank, and seconds later was gone. But if Ella had truly tampered with Marina's drink, she would have needed access before the party. Perhaps she anticipated something: Marina's instability, her tendency to spiral. What if Ella had prepared a drink just in case? A just-in-case-she-snaps solution, a fatal sedative. She wouldn't intend to use it unless provoked. But Heather's appearance, her cheerful recollection of a traumatic past, may have triggered Marina, and in turn, triggered Ella. The daiquiri became a weapon. Now, Miss Marple had motive, method, and opportunity aligned. She contacted the coroner discreetly through Chief Inspector Craddock, a man she had worked with before and trusted. She asked whether the poison used in Heather's murder had been identified. "Yes," Craddock said. "Barbiturates. We're checking local prescriptions. Marina Gregg has a prescription for Nembutal, but she swears she hadn't taken any in days." That sealed it. Miss Marple invited Craddock to tea and laid out her theory. Carefully, respectfully, but with her usual precision. Craddock listened, eyebrows rising higher with every revelation. "You're suggesting the secretary did it?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Not out of malice, out of devotion and fear." But the result was the same: murder. Craddock exhaled. "We'll need proof." "You'll get it," she said. "Check the bottle." Count the tablets. Compare the dosage left with the last time Marina claimed to have taken any, and look for fingerprints. I suspect you'll find Ella Zielinski's, and possibly even a glass stashed or rinsed hastily somewhere it shouldn't be. As she sipped her tea, Miss Marple added one final thought. Sometimes the greatest tragedies are caused not by hatred, but by love. Craddock nodded solemnly. We'll bring her in for questioning. And with that, the noose quietly closed. The police summoned Ella Zielinski to the station late that evening. The interview room was sterile, the walls an uninspired shade of gray, and the air heavy with unspoken suspicion. Chief Inspector Craddock sat across from her, notepad in hand, but it was a silence that spoke the loudest. Ella tried to maintain composure. Her glasses glinted under the overhead light, but the slight tremor in her hands betrayed her nerves. You've been working for Marina Gregg for how long? Craddock asked. Just over 2 years. And in that time, would you say you've grown close? Ella hesitated. I respect her. She's a remarkable woman. Talented. Vulnerable. People forget how hard it is to carry trauma the way she has. Yes, Craddock nodded. Trauma. Like the incident Heather Badcock reminded her of at the party? That hit home. Ella's eyes flickered. Just for a moment. She didn't mean to upset her, Craddock continued. But Marina clearly reacted. Witnesses say her demeanor changed immediately after that conversation. She was blindsided. Ella said quietly, So were we by Heather's death. There was silence. Craddock leaned in slightly. We found your fingerprints on Marina's Nembutal bottle. More than once. Care to explain? Ella's throat bobbed as she swallowed. I sometimes tidy her things. I organize a tray. That's all. We've also checked the bottle count. There are fewer tablets than there should be. Did you know a barbiturate like that can dissolve easily in alcohol? Barely noticeable unless you're looking for it. Ella's composure wavered. I didn't. Craddock cut her off gently. Ella, think very carefully before you continue. She looked at him, eyes welling up, and then she broke. I didn't mean to kill her, she said suddenly, voice sharp with emotion. It wasn't for her. It was never supposed to be Heather. The confession came not with bravado, but with anguish, as if she had been holding her breath for days. Craddock remained calm. Then who was it for? There was a long pause. Marina, aghast with silence, filled the room. Even the walls seemed to lean in closer. She was coming undone again. I've seen it before. The blank stares. The shaking hands. I knew the signs, Ella said, almost in a whisper. I just thought, if she started to slip in public again, it would destroy her. She wouldn't recover. That party, Heather's words, she looked like she was about to collapse. I thought she might do something reckless. Hurt herself. Or worse. So you poison her drink? Craddock asked. I prepared one. Just in case. 1 glass. It was supposed to calm her. Maybe make her sleep through the rest of the night. But Heather took it. Marina tried to stop her, I swear. She reached for it, even gasped. But Heather was cheerful, oblivious. She took it before anyone could stop her. She buried her face in her hands. It wasn't murder. Not really. Craddock said nothing, because it was. Meanwhile, at her cottage, Miss Marple received word of confession. She wasn't surprised, but she was saddened. Crimes born of hate are easy to understand, in a grim way. But crimes born of twisted love and desperate protection are more complicated. They reveal the fragile edges of the human heart. She remembered a line from a long-forgotten novel. The deadliest blade is the one drawn from mercy. The next day, the headlines read, Assistant confesses in Gossington poisoning. Marina Gregg's secretary arrested. Reporters swarmed the gates of Gossington Hall again. This time not for a film screening or celebrity sighting, but to glimpse the aftermath of tragedy even a scriptwriter couldn't have penned better. Marina Gregg released a short statement. I am devastated by what has happened. Heather Badcock did not deserve such a fate. My heart aches for her family. And for Ella, who in trying to protect me, committed an unforgivable act. Miss Marple sat by her window that morning, knitting in her lap, watching the village stir back to life. The mystery had ended. The truth had emerged. And still, there were no victors, only survivors. She closed her eyes for a moment and murmured, "The past is never past, not when it follows you into every room, every stage, every smile." Even in a village as charming as St. Mary Mead, the screen could still go dark. And when it did, it left behind more than silence. It left behind shadows. The village of St. Mary Mead returned to its sleepy rhythm in the days that followed, but the mood remained somber, though the police had secured confession, and the newspapers had spun the story into lurid drama. For those who knew Heather Badcock, or believed they did, the loss was no less real. And for Miss Marple, the case was not quite closed. Not yet. She had always believed that truth wasn't simply found in courtrooms or confessions. It was buried deeper, behind motivations, regrets, and the invisible fractures in people's lives. Ella Zielinski had confessed to drugging Marina's drink. Yes, but there were lingering shadows in the story. And as Miss Marple had learned long ago, even the best of confessions can conceal inconvenient truths. So she went back one more time to Gossington Hall. She was met by Jason Rudd, who looked gaunt and prematurely older. The ordeal had aged him. His boyish energy had faded into something more fragile. He led Miss Marple to the drawing room, where the curtains were drawn and the air was heavy with quietude. "She's resting," he said of Marina. "She hasn't been herself. I'm not sure she'll ever be." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Trauma rarely departs completely. It just changes costume. Jason poured tea, but neither drank. "She's blaming herself," he said, staring at his hands. "Thinks if she hadn't reacted, if she hadn't shown weakness, none of this would have happened." "Reactions are not crimes," Miss Marple replied softly. "And trauma is not a flaw. It's a wound." He gave a humorless smile. "You'd think we'd all be better at healing by now." She leaned forward. "Mr. Rudd, forgive me, but I must ask, that drink, the daiquiri, was it really mixed fresh at the bar that night?" Jason blinked. "Yes, of course. I made it myself." "Could anyone have touched it before you poured?" He considered. "Only Marina." She took 2 glasses over. One for herself. One for Heather. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "And Marina took a sip, didn't she?" He hesitated. "Yes, just one. A small one." Then she stopped. "She stopped? Why?" Jason looked away. "She said it tasted strange." But Heather had already downed hers, and Marina said nothing. Miss Marple stood. "Mr. Rudd," she said gently, "I must speak to Marina, not to question her, just to understand her." He was reluctant at first, but eventually led Miss Marple upstairs. Marina Gregg sat in an armchair in a room flooded with pale afternoon light. She was wrapped in a shawl, a book resting unread on her lap. Her expression was distant, but she turned when Miss Marple entered. "You solved it," Marina said. "Everyone says so." "No," Miss Marple replied. "Ella confessed. That's not quite the same." A pause. Then Marina whispered, "She did it for me?" "Yes, but you didn't stop her." Marina looked up, startled. "You knew, didn't you?" Miss Marple continued, "That she had done something. That Heather drank what was meant for you." Marina's silence was deafening. "She came here that night," Miss Marple pressed, "told a story from the past, about the day you fell ill, the day you miscarried, when she forced her way into your dressing room to meet you, and you realized then she was the cause, the one who brought the virus, the one who cost you your children." Marina's hand trembled. I saw your face when she spoke. A lifetime of pain crashing back. You froze. But more than that, you broke. And for a second, you wanted revenge. Marina looked at the window. "Yes," she whispered. "I did. Just for a moment." Miss Marple's tone softened. "And then you saw the glass. The daiquiri. You knew it had been tampered with. Ella had done it. You could have stopped Heather. Warned her. But you didn't." "I couldn't move," Marina said. "My body, my voice, everything shut down. I watched it happen like I was underwater. And when she drank, when she smiled, I thought it was fate, not justice. not murder. Fate. But that moment, Miss Marple said, was the true tragedy. You let someone else carry out your vengeance. And now, someone innocent is dead, and someone loyal sits in cell. Tears welled in Marina's eyes. I didn't want her to die. But you didn't stop it either. Miss Marple walked to the door. You must decide what kind of ending you want, Miss Gregg. You're a woman of stories, and this is yours. But stories only have meaning when we choose to face the truth in them. As she left the room, Marina whispered after her, Will anyone forgive me? Miss Marple paused in the hallway. That depends, she said, on whether you begin by forgiving yourself. The curtain hadn't quite fallen on this tragedy. Not yet, but it had begun to draw. Because sometimes the most haunting deaths aren't the ones we watch unfold, but the ones we allow to happen. The days that followed were slow and deliberate, like the final notes of a requiem. The police had wrapped up their investigation, and though Ella Zielinski was now in custody, the murmurings of the village still lingered like the faintest aftertaste of a bitter drink. The headlines had faded, but the shadows of the past continued to stretch long into the future. At Gossington Hall, the screen that had once illuminated the grand room with the shimmer of Hollywood glamour now stood dark. The guests had dispersed, the lights dimmed, and the laughter stilled. The only sound in the house was the echo of memory. Miss Marple stood in the garden one last time, her eyes scanning the horizon, the peaceful village that had always been home to so many secrets. This was the end of a tale. But, as always, the village was still full of stories. Marina Gregg had withdrawn from public life, retreating to the sanctuary of her home. There would be no more films, no more public appearances, and certainly no more celebration. Her greatest triumphs had become her greatest sorrows. The tragedy of Heather Badcock's death was never truly resolved for Marina. She would live the rest of her days with the knowledge that her silence had allowed a woman to die. A woman who, despite all her faults, had been a reflection of the mistakes Marina had tried so desperately to leave behind. It was a haunting burden. But in the quiet of her home, away from the prying eyes, Marina began to face something she had spent years avoiding, the guilt. And in doing so, she made peace with herself. She'd never find absolution in the eyes of the world. But perhaps in the quiet of solitude, she might come to forgive the darkest corners of her soul. Jason Rudd, the man who had once been her greatest supporter, was a changed man. He had witnessed firsthand how the bright spotlight of fame could burn just as fiercely as it could shine. His role in the drama was minor, but his guilt weighed heavily. He had unknowingly allowed the poison to slip through the cracks, and though his own conscience was not stained with murder, it would be a long time before he could look at himself in the mirror without questioning the decisions that had led them all to this point. For Ella, the future was uncertain. Behind bars, she had finally broken down in full. It was clear that her love for Marina had blurred her judgment, but it was also evident that she had acted out of a misguided sense of loyalty. The courts would decide her fate, but Miss Marple knew that the real sentence was already being served in the form of self-inflicted remorse. No prison could cage the mind's ability to punish itself. Miss Marple returned to her quaint cottage, the small cup of tea in her hand, the same room, the same comfort. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the village of St. Mary Mead slowly settled into its usual routine. The gossip about the film's fatality faded, replaced by newer whispers and newer scandals. But Miss Marple knew. She had seen the same pattern time and time again. The cycle of tragedy and redemption, of crime and consequence, was an eternal one. She sat by her window, watching the world outside, thinking about the broken lives she had encountered. For once, she was at peace. The truth had been revealed. Justice, in some form, had been meted out. But as she sipped her tea, she knew that for all the answers that had been provided, for all the puzzles that had been solved, there would always be another tale waiting to be uncovered, another secret buried beneath the surface. And so, the screen went dark, not with the finality of an ending, but with a quiet promise that somewhere beneath the surface of every story, there's always another mystery, always another shadow lurking just out of view. Miss Marple closed her eyes. She had seen it all before, and she would see it again. The truth was out there, and where there was darkness, there would always be light. Did Miss Marple solve the mystery, or did the killer escape justice? You won't want to miss the final twist in this thrilling tale. Like, comment, and subscribe for more mystery stories. And let us know your thoughts on this shocking film fatality in the comments below.